Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to moderate the first panel of the conference, Reflections from Past Executive Directors of CLAGS. So these individuals have led this center over the past 25 years through changing political climates to advocate and create a space for queer research and studies so that our lives are visible and our voices were heard. So I'd like to invite them up to the stage to take their seats. We have Alisa Solomon, who was CLAG's executive director. Can we give Alisa a round of applause? Come on up. We have Paisley Currah, Sarah Chinn, and Kevin Nadal. Jill Dolan could not join us. She had an unexpected situation come up, but I would like to, their bios, their full bios are included in the program. But Alisa Solomon served as CLAG's executive director from 1999 to 2004. Is a professor and director, arts concentration, master's program at Columbia University School of Journalism. Paisley Currah, executive director from 2004 to 2007, professor of political science and women and gender studies, Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center. Sarah Chinn, CLAG's executive director, 2007 to 2011, associate professor and chair of the English department, Hunter College, CUNY. And Kevin Nadal, CLAG's executive director, 2014 to present, associate professor, psychology, John Jay, School of Criminal Justice, associate professor of clinical psychology, Graduate Center, and associate professor of lots of roles, critical social personality psychology, Graduate Center. So we have about an hour, so I want to just dive right in here. Thank you all again for being here. My first question is if you all could, and you know, whoever would like to answer, you know, when you're moved is fine. But if you all could talk a little bit about, you know, during your time as executive director of CLAGS, what were some of the social political, sort of thinking about the climate, right, the social political climate, what were some of the issues that were most pressing that you were challenged by and that CLAGS took on?
Maybe that's when we should do chronologically, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, good morning.
Good morning.
And thanks, it's nice to be here, and congratulations, everyone. 25 years, it's kind of astonishing. We all must have been 12 when we were executive director. So the late 90s and early 2000s were in some ways like what Kevin was just describing to us, the attacks on CUNY and the reduction of CUNY funding were battles that we were fighting then, particularly under pretty severe attacks from Mayor Giuliani, whom you may recall, who was really on a rampage to do away with public everything. And we really understood the attacks on CUNY, I think, as part of his desire to privatize everything in the city. And he used a lot of the sort of the playbook of the culture wars for that, going after the Brooklyn Museum, for example, as you may recall, because of Chris O'Feely's art. And so we really understood the dangers of those kinds of attacks on free expression and dissident ideas and public funding as principles that we needed to address generally, but also as something that particularly had to do with what we were doing at CLAGS. And we mobilized a fair amount, I think, to address that. You know, George Bush had come into office promising in his campaign not to appoint an LGBT liaison to the community, proclaiming his support for sodomy laws, and his opposition to adoption by queer parents. And the Supreme Court ruled that Boy Scouts were entitled to exclude gays. So that was sort of the climate when I became the ED of CLAGS, and then I was here on 9/11. And that had a huge impact, of course, on all of New York and the nation and the world, I guess you could say. And we had a I remember our first fall board meeting that year was just days after 9/11, and we talked a lot about the question of what we what was our purpose, you know. I remember the day of the attacks, and around that time, the term essential personnel coming into the discourse. I worked downtown. I was teaching at Brooklyn, of course, the grad center at the time, and also writing for The Voice, which was downtown, and it was hard to get to the office because only, and I lived downtown, because only essential personnel were allowed, you know, below a certain point. And so we kind of asked ourselves, in what ways were we as scholars and queer activists essential personnel? We weren't rescue people, you know, and so on. And we actually issued a special edition of the CLAGS newsletter where about half a dozen CLAGS members and affiliates wrote about what it meant for us to be insisting upon critical inquiry, space for dissident voices, questions about how nation was being defined by heteronormative family at that moment, and so on, and sort of renewed the urgency and the connectedness of our scholarship and our community work. So,
Thank you.
I guess I should leave it there.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I became the ED, I think, in 2003, and that was the year that the Lawrence decision came down. So that's the year that, you know, the Supreme Court said that yes, gay people can have sex in the privacy of their bedroom. So, you know, this kind of is like neoliberal agendas have been going on forever, but in terms of like what's going on with LGBT movements and studies, like that was a kind of a beginning of a kind of crucial time for queer movements and also for CLAGS in that movement, in terms of like succumbing to the kind of rhetoric of like homonormativity, and we can be equal citizens, we'll keep fighting for marriage rights, you know, now that we have the right to have sex in the privacy of our bedroom. And if CLAGS, of course, is always, you know, trying to keep the agenda broader than that. So, you know, CLAGS we've done a lot of work on questions about, you know, gay marriage. I think during that time, the Beyond Same-Sex Marriage, you know, statement came out. So we were doing things to try to kind of keep the kind of questions broader in this moment of kind of like the securitization of everything and the privatization of everything else.
Can I,
yes,
just to jump, just because of that ruling, I think it is worth noting that the impact of queer studies, that ruling cited the work of Jonathan Ed Katz and
Right.
John D'Amelio, and, you know,
Yeah.
that was huge for us, right?
Exactly. I mean, you know, CLAGS has always been, you know, its mission has always been to show that, like, the work of academic can be important for kind of queer and queer projects, and that academics should be talking to activists and folks in the movement, and like nothing could make that clearer than the heavy citation of Chauncey and D'Amelio and all those folks in that decision. So that was one aspect of the political climate. Another aspect that I kind of found a more kind of micro aspect is like at this point, like transgender studies hasn't really emerged, and transgender still has a sort of tenuous relationship to LGBT movements. Like in, you know, around 2003, some of the like gay movements had changed their mission statement, some of them had not, but they were like starting to officially take on the mantra of transgender equality. Of course, now they all are because their funding streams are drying up, and they need to kind of keep talking about all the stuff they need to do. So they're all for it now. But in that moment, there was like a lot of interesting things were happening, and like around the same time I became ED, it was the exact same time I like just started to transition in my life, and presented myself as a man. And there's a lot of funny moments because we were doing more trans programming as a result of my own interests, and that was highly popular. A lot of people came, but I do remember there was a panel on I can't remember the exact thing. It was kind of on lesbian history, and I just remembered that Blanche Cook was there, and she was wearing these fabulous red leather boots. That's my memory of the panel. But if you're gonna have one memory of a panel, that's the one to have. But I remember talking to a couple of women outside the hall about it. And they're saying, yeah, we love this panel because this is really a good thing to be doing because CLAGS is just doing so much trans stuff and we just don't like all that trans stuff. And I was like so thrilled because clearly I was passing. They didn't know I was trans. So I didn't really care about their critique of CLAGS, but I was like, oh right, I love these women. So that was kind of an interesting, time for CLAGS. We did a trans politics conference. We raised lots of money, and just to give you a sense of CLAGS then, and possibly still now too. We had a very good organizing committee. We worked really hard. Half the conference presenters were trans women of color. It was super diverse, funded. We paid for people's travel, the whole thing. And then the conference, as a trans thing will do, attracted all these white trans masculine people from the Northeast private liberal arts colleges. And so the big critique of the conference was that the audience wasn't representative enough. And it was that's a fair critique, but it's also kind of wow, we really did a good job if they're not critiquing the panels, but they're critiquing the audience. So that's kind of a typical kind of CLAG. I love CLAGS as kind of the kind of people who give feedback to CLAGS because they're really interested in keeping us on our toes and making sure that we always work harder the next time. Okay, I guess I'll stop there on my climate remarks and pass it on.
Okay, so there we go. I would say that 2007 to 2011 was a period of simultaneous expansion and contraction. So expansion in the, I think we each of us has this watershed political moment. So of course for us, it was the election of Barack Obama. That was kind of the big one that happened in 2008. And at the same time, the economic collapse. So I had come into the job at a moment in which the US economy was just booming and donations were at a good clip, and we had amazing grants that Paisley had put together from the Ford Foundation for the International Resource Network that Alisa, I'm sorry, I apologize.
And that Paisley carried forward.
Yes, I'm sorry. That Alisa put together and Paisley carried forward, and I continue the job I hear you, believe me, I'm sorry. So we had that, we had a bunch of stuff going on, and then on the micro level, each meeting that I had with the president and the provost, which at that point was Bill Kelly and Chase Robinson, was, oh, by the way, we're cutting your budget in this way. And by the way, that tax levy money you were getting to employ the lovely Yasmina Sinanovit, you're not going to have that anymore. And by the way, you're going to have fewer course releases. And by the way, blah, blah, blah. So, but at the same time, so that was happening sort of micro and macro, obviously. So our resources were just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking before our eyes in terms of, obviously, funding to CUNY, which is still in crisis, funding to CLAGS more particularly, but also people feeling like our members feeling less keen to renew at the levels that they had. So fundraising became it had always been a concern for sure, but it was an enormous issue during my tenure. So that was sort of just on the organizational level. But we expanded in these amazing ways as well. The IRN just kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I had the amazing opportunity to go to the International Association for the Study of Sexuality, Culture and Society conference in Hanoi to sort of talk about the IRN, which was just amazing to meet scholars from all over the world. and I had never been to Vietnam before, so that was really exciting for me. But also that, and I think building on what Alisa and Paisley were talking about, realizing that we had to step away from the language of diversity and towards the language of representativeness. That CLAGS's mission was not to be diverse, it was to represent our community and the work that was happening within the community, and the bulk of the most exciting work was being done by queer and trans scholars of color. And that was just the truth. So in order to represent the field, we had to make sure that those voices were front and center in the work that we were doing. And that was something that just became increasingly clear to all of us. I would say as well, we also kind of unconsciously got ourselves in the middle of this generational split between the first generation of queer activists and the sort of emerging and current generations of activists and scholars with our Lesbians in the 70s conference. That it was a really interesting experience for me as someone who was, came of age in the 80s, right, between those two moments. That it represented, on the one hand, it was thrilling to see literally hundreds of women who had not seen each other in decades and for whom lesbian identity was, in many ways, what Kevin was talking about, that they were the first generation who could and would be openly lesbian in every part of their lives. That before them, it had been structurally impossible. And that bravery, what that took, that courage that it took to do that in 1971 was astounding. And yet at the same time, sort of their relationship to the new generation of queer people, of trans people, was conflicted, was very conflicted. And in fact, it was really interesting because the younger people were saying, oh, we owe so much to this older generation. And the older people found it very difficult to hear that. So that, to me, I mean, I know this is sort of it's not a political climate in a macro sense, but it was really interesting to me that here was this moment where this generation of lesbian activists who were disappearing and whom we felt it was so important to honor, could and could not connect to what was going on in the present moment. And that was, it was really striking to me, I would say. So I think that's all I have. One thing I will say, it was really interesting to be, and I think I was the first ED of CLAGS who was a woman who had young children. And so that being able to figure out as well how that factored into my administrative role was a really interesting challenge and actually helped me now that I'm chair of English. I learned so much just about being an administrator and dealing with people in a variety of ways from being at CLAGS. And I think one thing that I think we all share is just a little shout out to the amazing staff at CLAGS who the turnover is pretty high because the pay is pretty crappy and there are no benefits. But one thing that has been really amazing, I mean, first of all, just to Yasmina, who has been with us for such a long time and has really been this rudder who has moved CLAGS through many difficult moments, but also that CLAGS for the ED, for the board, for the staff, for the interns, for the award winners, has been this engine that has moved us all forwards. And it hasn't just moved the field forwards, although that's also true, but I think it's also moved us forwards personally, in our careers, politically, interpersonally, in terms of connecting with people, and to see former CLAG staff members go on to amazing work in the things that they're doing has really been gratifying. That it is a crucible, not just for the incredible academic and activist work that we do, but also for generations of queer scholars and activists and administrators who sort of cut our teeth at CLAGS. So thank you.
And Kevin, before you answer, just sort of following along this theme of firsts, thank you for bringing that up. It sounds like there were some firsts that I also heard. You're also the first executive director of color at CLAGS, and so if you could just speak about that within the context of the question.
Sure.
Thank you.
So first of all, I love hearing these stories. This is just amazing. How often do you get to have the executive directors of any organization all in one place, or most of them? So shout outs to Martin, who will be here later, as well as to Jill, who couldn't make it, and to Jim Wilson, who couldn't make it. So I've been ED since 2014, so if you all can imagine way back then. 2014 was a great year, and as Sarah mentioned, like, you know, what were the pivotal moments? We've had a few pivotal moments since that time that I think have really shaped my role here at CLAGS. One is, if you think back to 2014, this is when there started to be more momentum with same-sex marriage being passed in various states, and so people started to, or some parts of LGBTQ communities found that to be the most important issue, and then other parts to say, like, that's not even an issue we care about at all. And so trying to balance the spectrum of what people deem to be important issues of the LGBTQ communities was something that CLAGS, I think, has been able to do quite well, but we have to be really intentional about it. And then last year, of course, with the Supreme Court ruling that CLAGS was here, and I remember being in the office, and I can't remember which staff members were in the office at the time, but like I came in, and you know, it happened in the morning. I came in, and I think it was Noam or Yana, I don't know, but then I said, "Hey, you saw the news?" We're like, "Yeah, cool," and then we continued with our day. And I think it was because, like, for CLAGS, it's like same-sex marriage and marriage equality is nice, and you know, many of us benefit from it, but it was one of many things that were pressing. It wasn't like this huge victory that we felt we needed for CLAGS. And then during this time, also we saw Black Lives Matter and police brutality and all these things coming to the forefront. And so I think that really helped us to shape our programming in terms of understanding intersectionalities. And so while intersectionalities had been addressed in previous generations, it was just something that just needed to be understood and conceptualized in every single thing that we did. To not only think about diversity and representation, but to be really intentional in how many panelists are of this gender identity, how many panelists are of different racial ethnic backgrounds, how many are international or domestic, and all those different things. So I think that's really something that we've been trying to do. We found the LGBTQ Scholars of Color Network, along with others from the Andy Casey Foundation, and I think that was something that was really important. So that started last year, and we had a conference with 200 folks from all over the country who identified as LGBTQ and people of color, as well as scholars and researchers. One thing that happened during my time was we changed our name, finally, to CLAGS Center for LGBTQ Studies.
Can I just say, we had talked about that
Yeah.
for years.
For years.
For years. And in fact, I remember being in the office and saying, how about CLAGS, the Center for LGBT Studies? And everyone was like, yeah, that's a great idea. I'm like, okay, we'll make that happen.
Yeah.
But of course, it didn't happen. So I was so glad when it actually happened.
And I think, when I first got into the position, everyone was like, I think there's a lot of this bureaucratic stuff that you have to deal with, that people aren't going to want to do it, or the administration is going to be against it. And it really just took like me talking to the administration and say, hey, we want to change our name. Is that cool? They're like, yeah, whatever. But I think, obviously CLAGS had been trans-inclusive and queer and bi-inclusive as best as we could, but I think like it was finally time for us to change it. And I think, I also have to give shout outs to like other organizations that did that in their name, because I think that they led as ways to say like, no, you could still be CLAGS and still be inclusive. And a lot of places have acronyms that don't necessarily stand for anything anymore. But I think that's why we kept the CLAGS part to really...
Like NAACP, for example.
Right.
Exactly.
Or NARAL.
Or NARAL, yeah.
Yeah, and you're not allowed to say what they are anymore. You're supposed to say like just what the acronym is. To Marta's question, I mean, I think I think there's been a lot of intention in being more intersectional, and I think, and speaking to Paisley, I think we have many more things that interest me, and I think that's one of the things of ED is like you get to help with your programming and help just establish what you want to do. And so this is why I think the LGBTQ Scholars of Color Network was important to me, because I think we needed that space, and I hope that it continues in the future. And I also think that there's so many other firsts that are going to come for the executive directors. Like first woman of color will be interesting if she could be next. Are you out there in the audience? First trans person of color, first, so many other things. But I'll just end there, but thank you so much, because I think we've come so far, and I like that we went in chronological order, because there's so many things that CLAGS has touched upon that maybe we oftentimes don't reflect upon.
So you don't have to answer this question in chronological order, but what were some of the most significant lessons that you learned during your time as executive director?
But I guess I want to pick up on what Kevin was just saying, and I'm trying to figure out a way to say this that doesn't sound in the slightest offensive, which is that CLAGS from its inception really was concerned with representation and diversity and the full panoply of queer lives and expression. And I think that different periods and the contours of the climate that we're just talking about made that play out differently, made different community needs, more pressing and come more to the forefront. But I think it's important to say that this has built on an ethos that Marty Duberman, cared about from the instance that CLAG started, and that was reflected in the programming, in the board members, and the constituencies, and all of that, really from the get-go. And because Marty and Jill aren't here, there's some important early events that aren't coming up. Like I think the Black Nations Queer Nations conference was just a mind-blowing, staggering, huge event that really was the first of its kind, and a million other events, the establishment of the Kessler Lecture, all those kinds of things that happened in the early years when I had the privilege of being on the board then, but before my term as ED. So what are some of the lessons that I learned? Well, that was kind of one of them, I suppose, was I think it's not an accident that CLAGS has been radical, and that the EDs have all come from, radical politics, that we haven't had any log cabin Republicans, who have wanted to be the ED of CLAGS because of that ethos. I agree with Sarah, I learned a lot about administration, just, having to deal with the higher-ups and stuff like that. I learned how to write a big, giant grant proposal and get, huge amount of money from the Ford Foundation and, go to those offices. Sort of, I learned how to run a board meeting. And I learned a lot from Jill Dolan about that. And one of the things I learned about that process was about keeping quiet and letting disagreement happen, because often the places of disagreement and tension were, places that created new sparks. And one of the things I think has been great about CLAGS, both in its, board meetings and in the meetings of committees putting on events and in the people talking on programs, is that there has been productive tension. And it's part of what's created new ideas and new work and the dynamism of what CLAGS is. It's not, we don't all agree. Despite our leftiness, we don't all agree on everything. And I learned a lot about the importance of airing and even fanning the flames of those differences and making contradictions and conflicts visible and productive. I learned a lot about disability issues in my time at CLAGS. We had been pressured properly from the community of people with disabilities to make our events even more accessible than they had been, and we started doing programming dealing with intersections of queer and disability issues, and that, you know, it was important to be held accountable on that. I think that's, and then, you know, there's so many specific things I learned from all, you know, the different programmings, like just certain ideas that still stay in my mind, things that people said. The first intern, I guess we're going to talk later about some of the programming and things, right?
But you can,
Oh, I
you
should
can
do
mention
that
it,
now.
yeah. if
Okay,
you'd
so
like to.
Paisley and Sarah already mentioned the International Resource Network. So that began with a meeting of 100 people from like 35 countries. And one of the most important things about that meeting was it had a schedule, but it didn't have an agenda. And I remember, you know, welcoming people to it and saying, you know, welcome to what we all are going to make happen. You know, we don't have an outcome in mind. We don't know what we're going to get together and talk and see what happens. And a lot of things were said in the various meetings that were really instructive. I remember Bernadette Muthian from South Africa saying, you know, it really makes no sense to talk about heteronormative nuclear families in cultures where the nuclear family is not the norm. You know, it's just really kind of knocking us off of a kind of North American centrism in how we were thinking about things. I think that project and so many others reaffirmed the importance of thinking globally and acting locally and globally, that, you know, even as we were building the International Resource Network and, you know, we were also creating the first CUNY-wide, the Queer CUNY conference that I don't know if it still happens, but for a long time it was an annual conference, and it was kind of astonishing to realize in, I guess it was 99 or 2000, I remember that had never happened before, that students and faculty in all the CUNY colleges had never gotten together to trade strategies and curricula and experiences, and that was I learned a lot from, especially from the students at those meetings. And finally, for now, I'd say that in my tenure, I started with Carolyn Dinshaw in the collaboration with the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at NYU, a series of pedagogy workshops that we called lesson plans. And those were for people teaching queer studies of various kinds, again, who had never gotten in the room. In most fields, you know, it's a real lack in academia. We don't talk about pedagogy. Hardly ever. We don't talk to our peers. I mean, I guess now, you know, with the web, we trade syllabi or reading lists a little bit. But we don't talk much about what we do in the classroom. And we created a series, met several times, like maybe half a dozen times a year, that went on for quite a while, where we did that, and I learned a ton about teaching and about thinking about issues in some of those sessions. I think we had one on teaching Foucault with Don Mengay and Rabab Abdulhadi. We had one on teaching Audre Lorde with Esther Newton and Shelley Eversley. We had one about whether or not it was productive to come out in the classroom and what kind of classes and so forth. We had one on teaching sexually explicit material with David Ng and Holly Hughes. We had a great one on teaching Bowers v. Hardwick with Kendall Thomas and Nan Hunter. So those taught me a lot about the need for those kinds of conversations and about a lot of things that I took into my own classrooms.
Anyone else? Significant lessons?
Yeah, I'll go. So I would say, similar to Alisa, the sort of micro and the macro, I learned how to say yes, and I learned how to say no. I learned how not to take things personally, and I learned how to take things to heart that I needed to learn. So that was, and I learned how to be an administrator. I mean, there's no, I had no training in any way to do that. So it was really learning on the job. And I think also, I learn, and I think this is a temperamental thing. I think, Kevin talked about how, and I think everyone sort of alluded to this, how we bring our own interests to the programming. Absolutely. But I think we also bring our own styles to CLAGS. And it was actually a really interesting way for me to recognize how I wanted to deal with conflict, because there was a fair amount of it, although less than at other times, and to figure out what compromise meant to me. And I sort of came up with this formula that compromise is when no one gets what they want and no one feels screwed over. And that actually seemed to be like, no one gets exactly what they want, but everyone feels like they got a fair shake. And that seemed to me, that was a thing that I learned, you know, because I learned to be much more accommodating, I think, but also to be more firm. I mean, it was this really interesting mix. It's like sometimes you have to say, no, we're not going to do that. I'm sorry, that's not appropriate for us, or I don't agree. But to do that in a way that's not authoritarian, because CLAGS is a profoundly anti-authoritarian institution. And to echo Alisa, I think I really learned about the transnational qualities of research into sexuality and gender that was happening all over the world, and how parochial I mean, I kind of knew that already, but in a really profound way, how parochial the United States is. And in that way, the IRN was an incredible eye-opener for me. On the other hand, I also learned that that CLAGS did something that was really unusual in that we weren't a policy institute. And so we could think about things differently from an NGO, or from an organization that depended solely on foundation grants, or from an organization that was involved with the UN, right, and that was kind of tied up with bureaucracy. And I learned that actually at ISEX, you know, which is people really had this sort of kind of global NGO way of thinking and speaking, and it made me realize, oh yeah, no, we're doing something different, not oppositional, but what we have to bring is a piece of the conversation that's actually not making its way into these discussions, and that we have a contribution to make, so that we have to learn a huge amount, but we also have a perspective that is about not just the instrumental, but also the possible, and the creative, and the imaginative. And that's something that doesn't often come to public policy conversations.
Yeah, this is a really great question. I just want to start off talking a little bit about the IRN, because I think when I became the ED of CLAGS, that was my biggest kind of nightmare, because Alisa had created it, had raised the money for it, and then I had to continue it. And Alisa was always very supportive and helpful in the background, and I think it really had been her vision. And so when we wrote, so we did continue, it grew. We got a second grant from Ford, and I worked really hard on that grant with Sarah Chinn, our development director. But I think when that grant came through from the Ford officer, and she emailed me and said, yeah, it's all fine, it's going through, that's the biggest relief I've ever had in my life. And the only person I was thinking about was Alisa. Like, it was just like, okay, I got the grant. I'm not a complete failure. Because I had a little bit felt like imposter complex squared when it came to the IRN. So when that grant came through, I thought, okay, it's not going to die under my tenure. It'll grow. It'll be good.
Nobody had the slightest inkling that anything was going to die under your tenure.
Okay, good. But it really had been Alisa's brainchild in raising the seed money and then the first Ford grant, and it's really quite an important aspect of CLAGS. So what I learned, I'm going to try to twist that around and say I learned about the situation of CLAGS. And the situation is this. There's this front end, which is like pamphlets and nice web page and all this great programming and this community that comes together and fights and agrees, and people love CLAGS. And then there's the back end. And you think, oh yeah, there's a big staff, they got programmers, they got finance people, they got this and that. And what you have is one ED with some release time, and then some, half time at the time we had, like, graduate students and, young people working for CLAGS, like many of whom, learned on the job. Like the disconnect between what the CLAG looks like on that front, the back end is just hilarious. Like we had a web page. I think when I was in the board, I had put the web page, and we still, when I was doing it, I just had taken an HTML course at Brooklyn College. So I was the webmaster and the ED. So everything about CLAGS has that kind of, when I was running anyways, had that kind of homegrown, fix it yourself, figure it out. And when I look back at those years, like the seminars in the city, the colloquium, the conferences, the raising money, like all that work that the staff and I, and also the board did, I can't believe it. I would never in my life now work so hard again. Kevin, close your ears, Kevin. Close your ears. I mean, there's no way I would do that now. It was just like beyond a full-time job. And we haven't even started with the problem of like raising money. Because with CLAGS, everybody thinks the other people are paying. Like the people from the community who come in thinks, the institution is paying for it. The institution thinks that we should be like a standalone neoliberal startup raising our own money. So everybody thinks the other side is paying for CLAGS. So that's why we're always, making pitches. But like the back end of CLAGS is just a total miracle that it continues to grow and thrive, because from the outside, it looks, the front end, it looks very kind of neat and organized.
Even the grad center itself had that problem because, all the everything goes through the grad center, financial office and all of that. You can't like raise or spend a dime without it going through like 97 layers of bureaucracy here. I got called into a meeting in the finance office and we were accused of having an outside secret bank account because they couldn't believe that we were doing all of this programming and looking so great on the pittance that they knew we had.
I would say actually the other side of that, thank you, is during one of these incredibly grim money meetings in 2009, I remember going and I met with Chase Robinson, who was then the provost, and I was like, okay, I'm going to talk about how amazing CLAGS is and how much we do on so little. I'm like, look, here's our budget. If you take out the Ford Foundation money, it's like $120,000 a year. Just take out that, take out the IRN, and that's what it is. And we do this, and we do this, and we do this. And he said, well, just do less. And I was like, clearly you don't understand what we're about, because that's not how we operate. Do less, we need more. And that was a real eye-opener to me, this sense that, but also we were interestingly, I think we were expected to operate from I think the community believed we operated like an academic department that had just, had funding for its operations. And the Grad Center wanted us essentially to operate like a freestanding nonprofit. But we couldn't really do that either. So it is this sort of very weird betweeny place. And I think as well, our commitment to the community was what made us stand apart from the other research institutes at the Grad Center, that we saw ourselves as inextricable from the larger LGBT community in New York, in the US, and in the world. And that was amazing. And the amount of goodwill, I think, that we generated, that we would say, look, please come. We can't pay your airfare and we can't pay you any money, but please come. People are like, yeah, I'll be in New York anyway, I'll come. That there was this amazing goodwill that we had because of the work we did. But yeah, there's sort of this, shining on the outside and then like these little people running on the treadmill on the inside thing that I think was this amazing magic trick that we managed to do. I don't know if it's still like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I just want to add, like, I think everything that you're saying still resonates with me, which is awesome and then sad at the same time. Because it's awesome because we have this shared experience, and then sad because, like, why hasn't anything changed? So what I have learned is to be really vocal about that we're not shiny, and then it takes all these things to happen, and then people start to feel bad. And then they either start to give money or board members will actually step up and do more because they realize that I don't have this glorious thing that I'm doing. I don't get paid all these course releases. And I'm really intentional. I get paid, or what the Graduate Center provides is one course release per semester for me, which equates to about 11 hours a week. I can't tell you, I don't work 11 hours a week here at CLAGS. I work way more than that. But the problem is that I can't cut down to 11 hours a week because if I were to do that, then we would have like one program.
That was also a product of austerity because I got 2 course releases.
Right.
And between me and Jim Wilson, it was, well, why do you need this? It's like, because we do all the
We
work.
do so much, yeah. And so I think one thing that I learned all the administrative pieces. I learned how to fundraise. Sometimes I don't feel like an ED, I feel like a party planner because all these different things that we need to do to raise money. I've learned to negotiate being somebody that asks people for money while still being myself. Negotiating, talking to people who I know might be able to support us without feeling like a sellout, and then navigating that while being a young queer person of color and knowing that there are other things that are also getting in the way of how people perceive me. So I'm still learning in this role, but I do think what Paisley said was important, that whoever the next ED is, to know that this is what you're getting, because I think I didn't know that when I came in. I thought like, yeah, CLAGS, I love CLAGS. I want to be the ED of CLAGS. I'm going to apply. And then once I got the position, literally was told, congratulations, Kevin, the board has voted that you're the new ED of CLAGS. And then a follow-up email, like maybe a week later, by the way, CLAGS is going to close in 3 months if you don't raise money. And I feel like, oh my gosh, I feel like President Obama, like you're elected, but now we're in this deficit and you have to save everything. And so luckily that was able to happen with lots of great board members and the staff who've been amazing. But I wish that, one, that we can be more sustainable so that doesn't happen, but two, that would be communicated to not just future EDs, but to the community that we need your help to make this work.
Thank you all for your reflections. I did want to open it up before we close this panel to the audience if there are any questions that people have. If not, I definitely have another one. I have a microphone here if anybody has a question. Okay.
Yeah. But for the live streaming, we want them to hear your question.
And identify yourself as a founding
Board member.
board member of CLAGS, please. Jim Saslow.
Hi, my name's Jim Saslow. Yes, I was a founding board member. So that goes back to 1987, which we don't want to think about how long ago that was. But my question is just sort of a clarification. Several people made the distinction about representativeness versus diversity, but I'm still not quite clear what that difference was and what kind of a change in queer culture you're trying to describe. So anybody who could
Great question.
make that broader, I would appreciate it.
Since I'm the one who raised it, I'll respond. I think it's a change of perspective. I think, at least in my experience, and I really came to this through my experience doing political activism, which is not simply who's in the room, although that is hugely important, but where is the most important, most exciting work being done? And then how do we get that work exposure through the tools and the resources that we have? And how do we partner with organizations that are already doing that work, but don't feel like CLAGS would be an appropriate partner for them for whatever reason, because we're an academic organization, because we're in Midtown, because, somehow there's this sense that academia means not interested in grassroots issues. So for me, diversity, and this may just be sort of a personal political thing. To me, diversity always felt like this sort of weird top-down approach, or the sort of like, let's get people in here so that, I don't know, and I mean this with all due respect, because I think we all kind of have this, anxiety or ambivalence, so white people can feel better about being surrounded by people of color, essentially, and can feel like, well, we've done our job. But not thinking about what is the work that is happening in the field that accurately represents the field, that needs to be represented through CLAGS, and that in fact is the lifeblood of what we do, rather than, let me put it this way, diversity to me feels like the majority is doing the minority a favor to bring them in, Whereas representativeness is saying, this is what's happening. Let's make that manifest in the work that we do. I don't know if that's an accurate representation.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't see the distinction quite so clearly. I would have kind of the same question as Jim, and I guess sort of along the lines of productive disagreement.
Yeah.
I don't think that, CLAGS in the years I was Edie or Paisley, even before that, was liberal white people just trying to feel good with some people of color, in the room. I think that what was happening in the field in, various respects, in various, communities of, ethnic, racial, class, national origin, religion, all of those factors were very much in the represented in the work of CLAGS, in the board of CLAGS, in the committees of CLAGS, and in the programming of CLAGS.
I guess what I'm saying is more, I wanted the language we used to represent the work that we were actually doing. So we're in agreement. No, I'm not saying that we were like, oh, let's white people feel good about being surrounded by people of color, but rather we were doing that. And the language we were using to describe that was this kind of liberal multicultural language that did not accurately represent the commitment that CLAGS had had from the very beginning to having the organization represent the work that we do. Yeah. And so to me it was more, I want to describe accurately our political commitments and the work of our programming, and the language of diversity doesn't do that. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear.
And not to say that it was perfect,
no,
either.
And it's never perfect because academia is, kind of a racist, sexist, homophobic place. So it's never, people are always, and I would say as well, no matter how hard anyone tries, and I think we've all had this experience, people are going to feel shut out for one reason or another. And actually at Lesbians in the 70s, this was sort of like the most surreal, you in the red boots, this is my most surreal CLAGS experience. So we had 3 days of 300 crazy 75-year-old lesbians flooding the graduate center. And we were just going to our final event, and 2 women each came up to me within 5 minutes of each other. And one woman came up to me and said, I don't know why you don't have more young women here. I mean, they just don't appreciate what it was that we did for them, and what they have is due to our work. And I was like, you're absolutely right. 5 minutes later, a woman came up to me and said, I don't know why there are so many young people here. I mean, you should really have tried to get more old dykes at this conference. I mean, I swear to God, I was like, zoom, zoom. And then I realized, no, that's what we do. That's what we do. And I think this connects to what Paisley and Alisa and Kevin, you were saying, that because we provide this amazing set of services that are not really available anywhere else, and we are so focused on working with our communities, that people feel empowered to say, I want to see this, or I want to see that. And in some ways, initially I was like, oh, for God's sake, I was really irritated. But then in retrospect, I was like, good. I'm glad that they felt like they could come up to me and say, I didn't get what I wanted, even if I think that they're being unreasonable.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, just one, and this is kind of getting to maybe if you were going to ask the memory question, because it, for me, kind of summarizes a lot of what CLAGS does. We were continuing the work that Alisa had started on the disability series, and we had programmed something, I can't remember the full title, but it had the title Monster Dick in it. So it was something like Screening the Monster Dick or something. And it was in our calendar, and I got a call from Bill.
Apparently now a Republican candidate concerned.
Right, exactly. So I got a call from Bill Kelly, and I can't remember where, he must have been the provost at that time, and he was like, so that title, Monster Dick, does that really have to be in the title? I was like, yeah, that's, I think that's going to be in the title. And, he was savvy enough to know he couldn't really tell us not to put the title, but he was just testing the waters and see if I would change, and we didn't. So we had that, and it was, it was a disability studies colloquium, and this young academic was presenting on, representations of masculinity and how ableist they were, and then there was obviously stuff about, and it was, pictures of monster dicks and size and so on. But, we're a community organization as well, so we had a couple of folks in the audience that thought they would come to CLAG to see, a nice screen show of monster dicks. And they were very unhappy. They were very unhappy to have this whole disability stuff thrust in their face. So it was one of those. I mean, I hope they went away learning a little bit about disability studies. But it was like it was like a very paradigmatic kind of CLAGS moment when you have different communities coming together.
I want to give a time check, and I know that there's another question out there. Was there anything, Kevin, that you wanted to, okay. There's somebody right here, and then we'll come back there.
Hi, I'm Joan Lipkin, and I just want to thank you very much and congratulate you on 25 years and beyond. So my question is, sort of in your early thinking in the formation of CLAGS, but possibly as you're also thinking towards the future, what are your thoughts about collaborating and dialoguing with advocacy groups that are really boots on the ground kinds of places? Because I have to tell you that I was at the Creating Change conference in Chicago sponsored by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, and there were over 4,000 activists there, mostly young people, and it was very exciting and also complicated and difficult because they were really struggling with how to articulate issues and how to deal with difference in a productive way. Things kind of blew up, right? And I was thinking that it would have been so great if some of the kinds of folks that think and have these experiences were more involved in advocacy groups, and perhaps you are on an individual basis, but it feels to me, as somebody who's got a foot in both camps, that there's a real disconnect between what we can be doing as queer activists and thinkers and progressives. So I just wanted to sort of share that.
Can we, and just before you, I just wanted to hear what the other question was so that you all as a panel can kind of think about, because this is going to be our last question. Can we get a mic back to that person in the back row? So the first question is about the relationship between activism, community activism, and scholarship.
My name is Scott Kaplan. I happen to be the police misconduct and corruption officer of the Jim Owls Liberal Democratic Club, a multi-issue citywide progressive LGBT club. And I have a sort of impolite question. Is there something wrong with the picture where we hear about the struggles with CLAGS doing fundraising, while periodically there are scandals with compensation packages for CUNY chancellors and furnishing of offices for CUNY big shots? Is there something wrong with that picture?
In a word, yes.
Yes.
Obviously.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I love a housing allowance.
And I think it actually relates in some ways to the question about the academic activism. Did you say divide, Joan? Gap or something? This is something that CLAGS has, in a way, been accused of from the beginning, but also been very engaged with from the beginning. I remember I remember the participants from Latin America at that first IRN meeting, and they just they couldn't understand why people in the U.S. thought that there was a division between academia and activism. It was just not part of their reality, and that was a kind of instructive moment for all of us. CLAGS, at least as far back as I can remember, has partnered for programming for people who are members of the board, with Audre Lorde Project, Saja, Sylvia Rivera Project, all kinds of community activist groups, and most of us, also individually are activists, have been activists on all kinds of issues, intersectional issues, and so that's always there in the work and the programming, but maybe not always, again, visible on that shiny surface of, and maybe not always addressing the concerns of every single person who shows up for something in the way that they would want it addressed. But I think part of the work that CLAGS has done and continues to do, is important to do, is is to recognize the knowledges that activists on the ground are producing in their work, and recognize, which is that fuels the scholarship done in the academy, and challenges it at the same time as the work in the academy has been activist work. I mean, one of the important things that CLAGS does, and one of the things that's so great about this celebration today, which I'm happy it doesn't feel nostalgic, because because the work is still going on. I felt that way very much at the celebrations for the WOW Cafe that I was just at the last few days, which were remarkable. That the roots of CLAGS are in activist work of independent scholars. Yeah. Collecting our histories, critiquing, artistic and literary work, doing political analysis, all of those kinds. It came very much from the ground. And then the question of how does that keep going once you're institutionalized in a place, even in a big urban public university, is an ongoing question and productive tension. So CLAGS used to always have people at Creating Change, and people at Creating Change have always been on the CLAGS board, and so on. Whether that's a way to address things that blow up in places like that, I don't know. That's a whole other kind of question.
I think too, actually, another good example of that is outhistory.org. And a piece of that. So Jonathan came to CLAGS and said, "I want to do this thing. I don't really have that much in the way of resources, but I have a ton of time, and I want to learn how to do wiki stuff, and this is a really important project." We were like, okay, let's do it. And not only did we help build this incredible resource for everyone from grade schoolers to PhD students, and also managed to give prizes to people both in academia but also independent scholars to put together projects for the site. But also because of that, for example, I got a phone call totally out of the blue from Perry Brass, who was one of the members of the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, saying, "I've got every copy of Come Out magazine. Wow. And I need to scan it. Can I," and it was totally coincidental to the art history thing, "can I just come in and use your machines to copy?" And I was like, it's funny you should say that, because Jonathan Ned Katz just came to us and we're starting this project. And if we let you scan every copy of Come Out magazine, can we also put it on Out History? And he said, of course. So here was someone who was outside of academia, an author, a longtime activist, who saw CLAGS as a resource for a copy machine and a scanner, and that we would say yes, which we did, but that also it would expand into opening up this whole archive that I didn't even know there was a full run of Come Out magazine in someone's private collection. So I think that's a really nice example of where these things, just coincidentally sort of came together.
Our time is actually up, but I want to thank you all can we give them a round of applause for not only your dedication, but also just, I think, giving us a lot of insight into the history and the socio-political context, but also some of the issues that were raised are really important, and throughout the day, we're going to be exploring them more. So some of the topics related to programming and specifically what's happening now, how have people benefited, scholars, people who have been recipients of fellowships, what have they done with their work, and then also thinking about the future of queer studies and queer scholarship and accountability to community relationships between activism and scholarship. What is the future of queer studies? So thank you so much for starting off the day. It was a fitting beginning, and we're going to take a break. Great. Okay, thank you.